In April of 1922, the bodies of these 5 family members and 1 unlucky housemaid were found brutally annihilated in a lonely farmhouse deep in the Bavarian countryside. The scene was so shocking, so terrifyingly violent, it sent chills across all of Germany and left investigators scratching their heads with questions that still don't have answers. Over the years, in all the true crime cases we've covered, few have been as twisted and downright haunting as this one. It is so bizarre that detectives continue to study it even to this day. And one can only ask, what truly happened at that farm? Who could be so heartless as to slaughter an entire family and then stay in their home, living among them for days after the murders? Let's dive into the story of the Hinterkaifeck massacre. Nestled half a kilometer from its nearest neighbor in the small town of Gruber, the Hinterkaifeck farm was a solitary cluster of buildings spread over 14 hectares of land. According to land registry documents from 1921, the property consisted of 4 main structures: the family's modest home, a large barn, a machinery shed, and a small engine room, which had been added just 2 years prior in 1920. The farm had been owned by Andreas Gruber, a man of considerable age and resilience, who purchased it back in 1886. By 1922, Andreas was living there with his wife Cecilia, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, and Victoria's 2 young children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. Victoria, still bearing the shadows of her late husband Karl's death in World War I, had returned to her father's home with her children, seeking stability in the only home she knew. The Grubers, while respected for their diligence and hard work, were a family shrouded in quiet mystery. Rumors whispered among neighbors suggested complex family dynamics, including questions about Joseph's paternity. Court documents from 1920 reveal a bitter custody dispute. Neighbor Lorenz Schlittenbauer initially denied paternity of the boy, even alleging that Andreas Gruber himself was Joseph's grandfather in a twisted entanglement. Though Schlittenbauer later acknowledged his responsibility and agreed to support payments, the idea of incest surfaced in at least 3 separate witness statements to the Munich police in April 1922, casting a dark shadow over the family's history. Life at Hinterkaifeck was not easy. The family depended on the help of household maids to manage the farm's daily grind. One such maid, Crescens Rieger, had worked at the farm since 1919, but quit in early March 1922. In her statement to the police on April 8th, she described an unsettling experience, saying, "Often at 12 o'clock in the night, my chamber door would suddenly open even though it was locked. I never saw anyone. After this happened almost every day at the same hour, I got scared and decided to give up my job." However, the stage for tragedy was set on March 31st, 1922, when a new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrived at Hinterkaifeck. Maria, 44, recently widowed, had responded to a newspaper advertisement for household help. Railway records confirm she took the 9:15 a.m. train from Schrobenhausen, arriving at Grobern Station at 10:45. Accompanied by her sister, Maria approached the farm at 11 a.m. The sister later told investigators, "The farm just seemed so incredibly lonely to me. I saw no one except Frau Gruber, who greeted Maria warmly." Maria brought a single suitcase and planned to send for additional belongings later, unaware that her first day on the farm would also be her last. Her sister left by noon, boarding the 12:30 return train, marking the last confirmed sighting of anyone at Hinterkaifeck by an outsider. That very morning, Andreas Gruber spoke to postman Josef Mayer about strange footprints he had discovered the previous day, footprints that led from the nearby forest to his farm, but with no trace leading back. Even before these footprints, Andreas had noticed other odd occurrences. A newspaper from Munich, the Münchener Zeitung dated March 25th, was inexplicably found on the property. Records show that the family did not subscribe to this newspaper, and neighbors confirmed they had not received it either. These small but unsettling signs hinted at the approach of something sinister, as if the farm itself were being watched. The days leading to the massacre were filled with strange silences and ominous absences. School attendance records show that young Cecilia Gabriel missed classes on Saturday, April 1st, though her teacher noted that occasional absences were not unusual. On the same day, coffee merchant Simon Reislender visited the farm for a scheduled appointment at 2 p.m., but found no answer. The dog didn't bark, which was strange. He later reported he always announced visitors. Sunday, April 2nd, the family was absent from both morning and evening church services, a notable departure from routine, as they had been regular attendees for months. Neighbor Michael Pearl passed the farm that evening and recalled, "Extraordinary silence, no dog barking, no sounds from the barn, but I saw smoke from the chimney around 6 o'clock. Even as their absence became noticeable, traces of life lingered, signals that the family had been there recently, but something had gone terribly wrong. By Monday, April 3rd, the pattern of silence had grown even more unsettling. Cecilia again missed school, and the postman found a pile of accumulated mail, including Saturday's and Sunday's newspapers. 11 pieces of mail now sat untouched in the mailbox. A hunting party passed by the farm later that afternoon. Georg Steinbach, a member of the group, testified, "We noticed no smoke despite the cold. Hans remarked it was odd. The Grubers always kept their stove burning in March weather." These small observations, seemingly trivial at the time, were all pieces of a puzzle that would soon reveal one of the most horrifying and inexplicable crimes of the 20th century. By Tuesday, April 4th, the eerie quiet at Hinterkaifeck had gone on for too long. Albert Hoffner, a farm repairman from Schrobenhausen, had an appointment that day to fix the Gruber's feed-cutting machine. He arrived around 1:30 in the afternoon, expecting the usual gruff but predictable greeting from Andreas Gruber. Instead, the farm was silent. He tried to make his presence known, whistling and calling out for nearly an hour, but no one came. Finally, at 2 o'clock, he broke the small padlock on the machine house door and began his work. For over 4 hours, he toiled in uneasy solitude. The animals cried in distress. The house remained still, and the wind carried an unnatural silence through the farmyard. The dog was nowhere to be found, Hoffner told police. "That animal always confronted strangers. Its absence disturbed me more than the locked doors." At 6:30 p.m., with the job done and an uneasy feeling gnawing at him, Hoffner packed up his tools and left. His receipt book shows he billed for 5 hours of labor plus travel, but what he took away was far more valuable: the chilling certainty that something was very wrong at the Gruber farm. That evening, he told everyone he met about the empty, lifeless farm where even the dog refused to bark. By 7 o'clock, his words had reached Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the family's neighbor, and the man rumored to be the father of Victoria's young son. Concerned, or perhaps compelled by something deeper, Lorenz sent his 2 sons, Johann and Joseph, to check on the Grubers. When they peered through the windows, the scene felt eerily frozen in time. No movement, no sound, only the desperate cries of hungry cattle. At 7:15 that evening, April 4th, Lorenz gathered 2 neighbors, Michael Pearl and Jakob Siegel, and together they made their way to Hinterkaifeck. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Pearl later recounted the moment with trembling detail. "All doors were locked, except the machine house, where Hoffner had broken in. We entered through there, then broke the door to the barn. Inside, the barn stretched 20 meters long, dark, cold, and silent except for the echo of their boots on the floorboards. About 5 meters in, Pearl's foot caught on something soft beneath the hay. When he bent down, his hand brushed against human flesh. I grabbed the foot and pulled," his April 4th statement reads. "It was Andreas Gruber. I looked closer. There were more bodies. Underneath the hay, 4 lifeless forms lay piled together: Andreas and Cecilia Gruber, their daughter Victoria, and little 7-year-old Cecilia Gabriel. All had suffered massive blows to the head, their faces barely recognizable. While Pearl and Siegel froze in shock, Lorenz Schlittenbauer separated himself from the group and made his way into the house. Somehow, he managed to unlock the main door, though how he did so remains one of the lingering mysteries of this case. Inside, the horror continued. In the master bedroom, Lorenz found 2-year-old Joseph still in his crib, his skull crushed. In the maid's room, Maria Baumgartner lay lifeless on the floor, her body covered with bedding, as if someone had tried to hide her clothing was draped across the windows, blocking the view from outside, suggesting that after the killings, the murderer had lived inside that house, unseen by the world. Seigel ran to summon the police while Pearl remained behind to guard the farm. When officers finally arrived at 9:40 p.m., the horror of Hinterkaifeck had only begun to unfold. Inspector Georg Reingruber from Schrobenhausen arrived at the farm around 10:30 p.m. with 2 constables. His initial report, filed in the early hours of April 5th, described a scene both gruesome and perplexing. "The barn victims," he wrote, "all suffered massive head trauma from a blunt instrument. Blood patterns suggest they were killed where they lay. The 7-year-old showed additional injuries, a deep gash across the throat, self-inflicted scratches on her neck, and clumps of hair in her fists. Medical examiner estimates she survived 2 to 3 hours after the others." Inside the house, the details were even stranger. In the kitchen, the inspector noted, bread had been cut, meat sliced, and coffee grounds were still in the pot, estimated to be 2 days old. The beds had been slept in recently. No sign of robbery. 700 marks were found in Andreas Gruber's desk. It was as though life had continued inside the house long after death had already claimed its residence. Someone had eaten their food, tended their animals, and kept the fire burning. A pickaxe leaned against the barn wall and was first believed to be the murder weapon, but the shape of the wounds didn't match. The following day, Dr. Johann Baptist Almuller, the medical examiner, performed the autopsies. His conclusion was chilling. All victims died from blunt force trauma to the skull. The weapon was likely a broad, flat instrument. Time of death between Friday evening, March 31st, and Saturday morning, April 1st. And one more unsettling detail. The animals had been freshly fed, the troughs refilled after the killings. Whoever murdered the Grubers had not fled immediately. They had stayed. By April 6th, detectives from the Munich Criminal Police had arrived at Hinterkaifeck, led by Inspector Franz Seiverhofer, one of the most respected investigators of his time. In a remarkable effort for the year 1922, the team documented over 100 pieces of evidence and photographed every inch of the property. Their findings would soon challenge everything the locals thought they knew. Bank records revealed that Andreas Gruber had withdrawn 200 marks just 1 day before the killings, yet the money remained untouched in his wallet. The family's safe still held another 500 marks. Robbery clearly was not the motive. Witnesses came forward with testimonies that deepened the mystery. A local resident named Karl Siebold, who lived about a kilometer away, told police that on Saturday night, April 1st, around 9 p.m., he saw a light moving between the farmhouse windows, as if someone was walking through the rooms with a lantern. Another neighbor, Crescentia Mayer, reported seeing smoke from the chimney early Sunday morning, suggesting someone was still inside. Phone records uncovered yet another mystery. In the week before the murders, Victoria Gruber received 3 calls from Munich. The caller's identity was never traced, and the telephone exchange had no record of who placed them. What had those calls been about? Warnings? Threats? Or perhaps final contact from someone who already knew what was coming? Over the decades, several theories emerged, each more unsettling than the last. The first and most enduring theory pointed directly at Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He had the motive, money and resentment, the key to the farmhouse, his inconsistent testimony, and his disturbing calm at the crime scene all painted a damning picture. Neighbors recalled his complicated relationship with Victoria. He once told a local farmer, "If I cannot have her, no one will." Others swore they heard him say that Joseph was his son, not Andreas Gruber's if true. That twisted love triangle could explain everything. But even with all the circumstantial evidence, police could never prove his guilt. There were no fingerprints, no weapon initially found, and no confession. When Schlittenbauer died in 1941, he took whatever secrets he had to the grave. Still, decades later, descendants of the Gruber family continued to believe he was responsible. The tension between both families reportedly lasted generations. Then came the Carl Gabriel theory. According to this line of thinking, Victoria's husband, long presumed dead in World War I, never actually died. Instead, he returned to find his wife living with her abusive father and raising a child whose paternity was in question. Some claimed Gabriel snapped in a fit of rage, murdering the entire family before disappearing once again into the chaos of post-war Germany. Yet this theory has never been supported by hard evidence. Gabriel's death certificate, wartime identification, and eyewitness accounts from fellow soldiers all confirmed he was killed in France in 1914. Still, rumors persisted because the idea of the dead husband returning for revenge was too haunting, too poetic to die out. Another, more complex possibility came from early police work: multiple killers. Some investigators believed the precision of the murders suggested more than one person. Luring 4 adults separately into the barn one by one would have been nearly impossible for a single killer. The theory proposed that at least 2 individuals were involved, one to subdue victims, another to strike. Some modern analysts also point out that the killer, or killers, seemed comfortable staying on the property, cooking meals and feeding animals, behavior not typical of a lone wanderer or stranger. The most mysterious element of all was the footprints in the snow. The day before the murders, a single set of footprints was discovered leading from the nearby forest toward the farmhouse, but none returning. Andreas Gruber mentioned it to his neighbors, unnerved. Days later, everyone was dead. Police measured the prints and determined they belonged to a man wearing handmade boots typical of local farmers. This detail tied the killer not to an outsider, but to someone familiar, someone from within their own small world. For nearly a century, the Hinterkaifeck murders have remained one of Germany's most haunting mysteries. A story that feels less like a crime and more like a ghost that refuses to rest. However, after the discovery of the hidden mattock in the attic in March of 1923, investigators believed they had finally found the missing piece of the puzzle. Blood and hair clung to the blade, and forensic analysis confirmed what many already suspected. It was the murder weapon. The tool, a heavy farming mattock combining an axe and adze, matched perfectly with the deep, clean cuts found on the victims' skulls. It was as though the killer had returned the weapon to its resting place, deliberately concealing it where only someone familiar with the farmhouse's every creak and corner would know to look. Court records revealed that Victoria, the Gruber's widowed daughter, had recently demanded higher child support payments from Schlittenbauer, a sum 3 times the amount he was already paying. That request had been filed just 2 weeks before the murders. To investigators, this was more than coincidence. And then there was his behavior at the crime scene, disturbingly calm, almost methodical. While others recoiled in horror at the sight of the mutilated bodies, Lorenz had gone straight into the house, moved objects, uncovered the bodies, and even handled young Joseph's corpse. When questioned about this later, he claimed he did it out of concern, but to police it looked more like control, as though he were staging his own version of events. Then there were the farmhands, Anton Bichler and Georg Siegel, who had worked for the Grubers in the past. Both had spoken bitterly about their former employers. Witnesses recalled Anton muttering that the old Grubers should all be dead after being accused of stealing chickens. But when police tracked them down, they both had strong alibis, each working at other farms many miles away during the weekend of the murders. And so, the trail went cold. The farmhouse, now infamous, stood empty and silent, its rooms still echoing with unanswered questions. For decades, it became a symbol of dread. Villagers avoided walking near it after dark, and children whispered ghost stories about the spirits of the Gruber family wandering through the woods. Nearly 3 decades later, in 1951, a determined investigator named Georg Angermeyer reopened the case. By then, forensics had advanced significantly. Using early forms of blood pattern analysis, his team reconstructed the likely sequence of events. One by one, the family had been lured to the barn, each struck down as they entered. The pattern suggested the killer waited patiently, ambushing them in near silence. The final blows fell inside the house, first on Maria, the maid who had started her job only hours before her death, and then on little Joseph in his crib. Years passed. The story of Hinterkaifeck faded into legend, but it never truly disappeared. In 1986, the Fürstenfeldbruck Police Academy adopted the case as a teaching model for young detective students pored over the old files, applying modern profiling techniques and psychological analysis. The conclusion they reached decades later was chilling. The killer had likely been someone local, male, middle-aged, and deeply emotionally entangled with the family. The files reportedly identified one prime suspect, whose name was kept secret under Germany's privacy laws, and who had died in 1945, just before the end of the Second World War. If that finding was accurate, it meant the truth had died with him. But the fascination didn't end there. In the early 2000s, forensic students at the Hamburg Police Academy reopened portions of the preserved evidence, attempting DNA testing on the blood-stained clothes and hair samples that had survived. Hopes were high that modern science would finally answer the century-old question. However, due to contamination and age, the results were inconclusive. Under Bavaria's 100-year confidentiality rule, the final reports remained sealed until the year 2022, exactly 100 years after the murders. Only then, perhaps, might the public finally learn if any traces of the killer's identity were ever uncovered. Today, the original Hinterkaifeck farm no longer stands. It was torn down less than a year after the murders, its stones and timber scattered or reused in nearby towns. In its place, a quiet memorial now stands, 6 names engraved on a weathered plaque, and a single date, April 4th, 1922. The day their bodies were found, not the day they died. That distinction matters because it reminds everyone that for nearly 4 days, the killer lived among them, in their beds, by their fire, listening to the cries of animals that no one came to comfort. The question that echoes across generations is simple, and yet impossible to answer. Why? Why would someone commit such senseless horror? And why, after so many years, does the case still feel unfinished? Perhaps it's because the details of Hinterkaifeck cut too close to home. It's a story about isolation, secrets, and the dark corners of rural life, where neighbors knew too much and said too little, and where silence protected more than the guilty. The plaque that marks the site says only one word in German, Warum, which means why in English. No names, no explanations, no comfort. Just the question that has haunted Germany for over a century. 6 lives ended on that lonely Bavarian farm, and no one was ever held accountable. The killer vanished, leaving behind not only death, but a mystery so deep that even time itself has not been able to bury it. Now, in the true crime world, German cases don't often make it into the spotlight. Hinterkaifeck is one of the few that people still talk about, but there is another shocking story from Germany, one that came straight from its capital. This is the disturbing cannibalism case of Armin Meiwes. I search a young boy between 18 and 25-year-old. Have you a normal body? I butchering you and eat your horny flesh. This chilling post might sound like the stuff of horror fiction, but it's very real. And it led to a crime so shocking, it made headlines around the world. What makes this case even more bizarre? The victim wasn't forced because he willingly agreed to be butchered and eaten. Now, before Jeffrey Dahmer shocked the world, there was Armin Meiwes, the man known as the most respectful killer, a title that might sound strange, but once you hear the twisted details, you'll understand why. And it all starts with his childhood, because like many killers, his descent into darkness began long before the horrifying act itself.
My name, Armin Meiwes. I was born 1961. I'm computer engineer from Rothenburg, Germany. I killed a man, slaughtered him and ate him. Since then, he is always with me.
Just as you've heard, Armin Meiwes was born on December 1st, 1961, into a family that, from the outside, seemed to have it all. His father was a police officer holding a stable and respected job. With his steady income, Armin's father was able to provide a lavish lifestyle for the family, purchasing a sprawling 36-room mansion measuring 16,000 square feet in Germany. It was a home that symbolizes wealth, success, and the kind of life that many would envy. However, within the walls of that grand mansion, the reality of the family's life was far from ideal. Armin's parents had a significant age gap. His mother was 40 when she married his father, who was only 21 at the time. This large difference in age set the tone for an uneven and troubled relationship. Armin later described his mother as extremely controlling, manipulative, and deeply possessive. She was frequently jealous and constantly accused her husband of cheating. Armin believed his mother had intentionally gotten pregnant with him, not out of a natural desire for a child, but as a strategy to prevent his father from leaving her. According to Armin, she didn't want a baby. She wanted to keep her husband. As Armin grew, he experienced the emotional toll of living in a home filled with tension. His mother's controlling behavior took a heavy toll on the family dynamic, with constant fights between his parents. These arguments would often escalate to the point where Armin's mother would threaten to kill herself or even harm him if things didn't go her way. This toxic environment created a great deal of stress and instability for Armin, who at a young age had to navigate an emotionally suffocating atmosphere. Armin was the youngest of 3 children, and as he grew older, the dysfunction in the home only worsened. His 2 older siblings, overwhelmed by the chaos and toxicity of their parents' relationship, decided to leave the family home when Armin was only about 5 or 6 years old. They were older teenagers, and they simply couldn't take it anymore. With their departure, Armin was left alone with his increasingly distant and cold mother. The absence of his siblings left him feeling even more isolated, abandoned not just by them, but also by his father, who would soon leave as well. When Armin was just 7 years old, his father left the family for good. One day, without warning or explanation, his father packed up and left, getting into his car and driving off, never to return. This abandonment was devastating for Armin, who had already lost his siblings and now found himself without a father. The emotional weight of these departures, of being left behind by those he should have been able to rely on, created a deep sense of loneliness that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In the midst of all this turmoil, Armin's relationship with his mother remained distant and unloving. She showed no affection or care for him. If anything, she was cruel and demanding, expecting him to handle the household chores that were beyond a young boy's capacity. By the time Armin was 6 or 7, he was already responsible for maintaining the household, while his mother barely contributed. She yelled at him regularly, creating an environment where he felt invisible and unloved. There was no warmth or tenderness in his home, only an overwhelming sense of neglect. To cope with the emotional turmoil he was experiencing, Armin turned to books. He found comfort in reading, and one of the books he became fixated on was Robinson Crusoe. This classic novel, while mainly about survival and adventure, contained a brief passage that would leave a lasting impact on Armin. In the story, there is a reference to cannibalism, a detail that captured his attention in a way he couldn't shake. At the age of just 10 years old, Armin found himself obsessing over the idea of eating another person. This morbid fascination marked the beginning of his dark and twisted desires. It wasn't just curiosity, it was an obsession that would define his life. Now, this fascination wouldn't come to life so soon. You see, when Armin was 19 years old, he left home and joined the West German Army, hoping to build a future as a professional soldier. He spent 12 years in the armed forces, a time when he felt a sense of normalcy that helped hold his darker thoughts at bay. During his time in the Army, he made some friendships with women, but none of them went beyond the surface. Armin began to question his own sexuality and would sometimes ask his friends, "Do you think I'm gay?" And his friends would respond, "That's something you need to figure out for yourself." One of his friends later mentioned that everyone seemed to know Armin might be gay, but he was the last to realize it. Or maybe he just didn't understand it at the time. Armin's confusion led him to start drinking more heavily. His alcohol abuse resulted in 2 car accidents, both of which were caused by him driving while intoxicated. After these incidents, he was kicked out of the Army. At the age of 32, Armin moved back home to care for his ailing mother. She was much older now, struggling with illness and unable to take care of herself. Although she had never been very independent, Armin's return to the house meant he would be the one to look after her in the large mansion they lived in, a place that once seemed full of tension and coldness. It was also during this time that Armin decided to change careers. He became a computer engineer and found success in his new job, working for a bank. However, the 1990s would soon introduce him to something that would change everything: the World Wide Web. Back then, the internet was new, and websites were often crude and unregulated. This lack of supervision would soon play a crucial role in Armin's growing obsession. As Armin began exploring the internet, he stumbled upon something he wasn't expecting: a community of people who shared his strange and dark interest: cannibalism. This online forum, known as Cannibal Cafe, allowed individuals with cannibalistic fantasies to meet and discuss their desires freely. For Armin, finding this community was both a shock and a relief. Finally, he wasn't alone. There were others who shared his twisted thoughts, and for the first time, he felt understood. The internet, with its uncensored space, blurred the line between fantasy and reality. Armin, eager to explore his desires further, created his own website where he could openly talk about cannibalism. He even began making fake images to fuel the fantasies of both himself and others in the community. Now, if you're thinking about searching it up, just a spoiler, the website isn't available anymore. However, if you use the Wayback Machine, this cool tool that allows you to browse old websites that have since vanished, you can still catch glimpses of what it once was. Although most of the site is gone, you won't find any of Armin's posts from that era. After things took a dark turn, his contributions were scrubbed. But it was essentially a forum, a place where people openly posted about their darkest fantasies. Users shared thoughts like, "I want to eat your flesh," or "I can't wait to kill this person and devour them." Disturbingly, such posts were not uncommon. It was in this disturbing corner of the web that Armin Meiwes, with his twisted desires, found a way to connect with others who shared his grotesque fantasies. Instead of simply talking about it, Armin decided to take matters into his own hands, quite literally. He visited butcher shops, bought real meat, and manipulated it to resemble human body parts. With a mix of sickening creativity and an eerie desire to be seen as a real cannibal, he photographed his creations and posted them online, painting a horrifying picture of murder and consumption. Many were fooled. They believed his gruesome posts and began to idolize him. After all, in a space where fantasies ran wild, Armin seemed all too real. His online persona gained traction as he continued to manipulate the forum, slowly building a reputation among the site's users as the man who was actually living out his darkest urges. But on the 2nd of September, 1999, Armin's life took a new turn. He came home from work, entered his mother's bedroom, and discovered her lifeless body. Most people would have been filled with grief or sadness, but not Armin. Instead, he felt an overwhelming sense of relief. For years, his mother had controlled his life, manipulating him with her possessive and abusive behavior. Without his mother's judgment and control, he felt free to fully indulge in his depraved fantasies. No longer confined by her presence, he took his obsession to the next level. One of the rooms in the house was transformed into his cannibal room, a place where he could live out his twisted dreams in private, untouched by any societal norms or restrictions. What followed was a descent into madness, as Armin began to seek out others who were willing to fulfill his darkest desires. And that post you saw on the intro, that was the beginning of it all. Surprisingly, Armin received numerous responses from people expressing interest, but most of them would back out at the last moment. However, one man stood out and was determined to follow through. This man, whose name remains unknown, continued emailing Armin back and forth, expressing a deep interest in Armin's bizarre and horrifying fantasy. In their exchanges, he openly admitted that it was his fantasy to be eaten. Armin, presumably intrigued, responded positively, arranging a meeting at his house. When the man arrived at Armin's mansion, he was greeted by a grim scene. Armin had set the stage for his dark intentions, laying the man out on a table while explaining, step by step, what was about to unfold. But in a sudden shift, the man admitted that he wasn't feeling well and no longer wanted to go through with the ordeal. To Armin's surprise, he allowed the man to get up, leave, and return home. Armin was clearly disappointed, but his primary desire was to find someone willing to participate. He didn't want to force anyone into the horrific situation he had planned. And if you think about it, that man was fortunate, as Armin wasn't entirely consumed by his madness, and the situation didn't escalate further. Armin, however, was undeterred. Still determined to create the illusion of fulfilling his grotesque fantasy, he resorted to a disturbing form of creativity. He crafted a lifelike body out of papier-mâché, painting it to resemble a real human form. Additionally, he acquired an old mannequin from a store that was being discarded, painted it to resemble a dead body, and photographed the result. Armin then posted these images on the Cannibal website, further fueling his online notoriety. The site's users were enthralled, believing that Armin had actually killed and consumed a person. They hailed him as a hero, a true embodiment of the cannibalistic fantasy they all shared. His fame within the cannibal community grew, with many users idolizing him for what they believed to be his gruesome deeds. Despite these online theatrics, Armin's desire to find a willing participant never wavered. He continued his search and prepared for the day when he would find someone willing to die for his twisted purpose. One of the rooms in his mansion was transformed into what he referred to as his slaughter room. This room was devoid of windows, with a cage to hold his victims and meat hooks hanging from the ceiling, an ominous setup reminiscent of something straight out of a horror movie. And finally, Armin's persistence paid off when he received a response from a man named Brandes. Brandes, a 34-year-old engineer, had been married but had recently separated from his wife after revealing that he was curious about exploring relationships with men. His inner turmoil over his sexuality had likely caused strain within his marriage, and his wife's departure left him to confront his desires alone. Brandes, too, had been active on the cannibal forums and expressed a willingness to participate in Armin's horrific fantasy. The two exchanged numerous emails, during which Armin detailed what he intended to do with Brandes's body once the act was completed. Brandes, in turn, proposed his own ideas, requesting that his skull be used as an ashtray after his death. In a deeply disturbing exchange, he also asked for his penis to be severed and for both men to partake in eating it together. Armin, who would later discuss his motivations in interviews, insisted that he never wanted to violate the wishes of his volunteers. If someone wanted to be consumed in a particular way, he was more than willing to accommodate their request. His twisted sense of respect dictated that every detail should align with his victim's desires. And after weeks of correspondence, a date was set. March 9th, 2001. Brandes would travel to Armin's home, where the two would carry out their unthinkable plan. Upon his arrival, they engaged in sexual relations before proceeding with the preparations. Armin, intent on minimizing Brandes's pain, provided him with sleeping pills, alcohol, and even Vicks, believing that this combination would dull any suffering. Brandes accepted these substances willingly, fully aware of what was to come. Armin also informed him that the entire process would be recorded, a way for him to relive the experience long after it was over. With the camera positioned and ready to capture everything, Brandes lay down on the table. Armin, staying true to the agreement, began with the act Brandes had requested. With a sharp blade, he severed the man's genitalia. In later interviews, Armin described how Brandes let out a horrific scream, but only for about 20 to 30 seconds. Blood sprayed from the wound, resembling a fountain, an image that would be forever burned into Armin's memory. But the night's horrors were far from over. Armin, still adhering to Brandes's wishes, took the severed organ to the kitchen. There he attempted to prepare it as a meal. With meticulous care, he seasoned it with garlic, salt, and pepper, before placing it in a pan with oil. The surreal nature of the moment was not lost on him, nor would it be lost on the investigators who would later uncover the grim details of this crime. After attempting to cook the severed organ, Armin plated it neatly, serving it to both himself and Brandes. But the experience was not what he had imagined. The flesh was incredibly tough and nearly impossible to chew. Disappointed, Armin admitted that it tasted horrible, chewy, rubbery, and just not what he expected. Meanwhile, Brandes was bleeding heavily, and the mess was getting out of control. To contain it, Armin moved him to the bathtub, thinking the running water would help. Every 15 minutes he checked on Brandes, expecting him to pass quickly, but the process was taking much longer than he thought. Time dragged on, and as he waited, he picked up a Star Trek novel to pass the time. Even as he read, Brandes was still alive, slowly fading away. After nearly 3 hours, Armin decided to speed things up. He walked into the bathroom, looked at Brandes, and simply said, "Sorry, but you're taking too long." He kissed him, then slit his throat. With Brandes dead, Armin got to work. He dragged the body out of the tub, chopped it into pieces, and carefully stored different parts in his freezer. The skull, however, was given a separate resting place. It was buried in his garden. The rest of the remains were wrapped and preserved for later meals. In an interview, Armin described how he carefully set the table, lighting candles and using his finest dinnerware. He prepared a piece of meat from Brandes's back, frying it with princess potatoes and Brussels sprouts.
It tastes like pork, a bit more harsh, substantial.
For the next 6 to 8 months, Armin lived off Brandes's remains, storing the pieces in his freezer under stacks of pizza boxes. He ate the meat in different ways, sometimes frying it, sometimes using it as a pizza topping, even having it for breakfast. But eating wasn't enough. He needed validation. He returned to the cannibal forums and uploaded photos of Brandes's remains, showing off his achievement to the dark corners of the internet. His posts sparked excitement among others on the site, and they showered him with admiration. By late November or early December, he found himself running low on his supply of human meat, which he had been consuming for several months. Wanting a fresh victim, he returned to the cannibal websites, posting advertisements for a new volunteer. However, his online activity caught the attention of an Austrian student who stumbled upon Armin's posts and the disturbing images he had shared. Realizing that this wasn't just a fantasy, the student tipped off the police, telling them, "I think this guy actually killed someone." So on the morning of December 10th, 2002, police arrived at Armin's mansion. As they searched the house, they initially found nothing unusual. However, when they opened the freezer, hidden beneath stacks of pizza boxes, they discovered 50 pounds of meat. Armin calmly told them it was wild pig, but upon closer inspection, officers noticed something shocking. The flesh still had human skin attached. Confronted with the truth, Armin didn't try to hide anything. He confessed immediately, admitting everything he had done, even handing over his computer, the photos, and the VHS tape documenting the crime. The police arrested him on the spot, and as the case unfolded, the details horrified the public. On January 30th, 2004, Armin was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to only 8.5 years in prison. This sparked outrage, as many believed the punishment was far too lenient. However, his defense was unusual but strong. Brandes had willingly participated, as proven by the emails and the fact that he had traveled to Armin's home voluntarily. This case exposed a shocking legal loophole in Germany. Cannibalism was not technically illegal. With public pressure mounting, prosecutors pushed for a retrial, arguing that Brandes was not in a stable state of mind to consent to his own death. On May 10, 2006, Armin was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Since then, Armin has undergone a surprising transformation. While serving his sentence, he became a vegetarian, rejecting meat altogether. He has also given multiple interviews, which are easily found online, where he speaks calmly and articulately about his crimes. Watching him, you wouldn't suspect he was a murderer. But if there's one thing true crime has taught us, it's that killers often look completely normal. Armin has acknowledged that what he did was wrong, but the damage was already done, and his case remains one of the most disturbing in modern history. So, what do you think? Did he deserve life in prison? Let me know your thoughts, and if you have another story you'd like me to cover next, drop it in the comments. If you like the way we create these videos, and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you for watching.